All right, guys, we're on chapter 6. What's wrong with our schools? Free to choose. What's wrong with our schools? This part is called elementary and secondary education. The problem. Even in the earliest years of the Republic, not only the cities, but almost every town and village in most rural districts had schools. In many states or localities, the maintenance of a common school was mandated by law. But the schools were mostly privately financed by fees paid by the parents. Some supplementary finance was generally also available from the local, county, or state government, both to pay fees for children whose parents were regarded as unable to do so and to supplement fees paid by parents. Though schooling was neither compulsory nor free, it was practically universal, slaves, of course, excepted. In his report for 1836, the superintendent of common schools of the state of New York asserted, under any view of the subject, it is reasonable to believe that in the common schools, private schools, and academics, or academies, the number of children actually receiving instruction is equal to the whole number between 5 and 6 years of age. Conditions doubtless varied from state to state, but by all accounts, schooling was widely available to white children from families at all economic levels. So yeah, he has white in parentheses, but to all children from families at all economic levels. Beginning in the 1840s, a campaign developed to replace the diverse and largely private system by a system of so-called free schools, i.e., schools in which parents and others paid the cost indirectly by taxes rather than directly by fees. According to E.G. West, who has studied extensively the development of government's role in schooling, this campaign was not led by dissatisfied parents, but mainly by teachers and government officials. The most famous crusader for free schools was Horace Mann, the father of American public education. As he is termed in the Encyclopedia Britannica article on his life, Mann was the first secretary of the Massachusetts State Board of Education established in 1837, and for the next 12 years he conducted an energetic campaign for a school system paid by government and controlled by professional educators. His main arguments were that education was so important that government had a duty to provide education to every child. All right. This is the first time I ever see you. Security being a bitch. First time I ever seen her right here. I'm always here. And for the next 12 years, he conducted an energetic campaign for a school system paid for by government, controlled by professional educators. His main arguments were that education was so important that government had a duty to provide education to every child, that schools should be secular and include children of all religious, social, and ethnic backgrounds, and that universal free schooling would enable children to overcome the handicaps of the poverty of their parents. In his secretarial reports to the Massachusetts Board of Education, Mann proclaimed repetitively that education was a good public investment and increased output, though the arguments were all pitched in terms of the public interest. Much of the support of teachers and administrators for the public school movement derived from a narrow self-interest. They expected to enjoy greater certainty of employment, greater assurance that their salaries would be paid, and a greater degree of control of government rather than parents were the immediate paymaster. Also, it was more for like the teachers, right? Not for the people they're educating. Despite vast difficulties and vigorous opposition, the main outlines of the kind of system urged by Mann were achieved by the middle of the 19th century. Ever since most children have attended government schools, a few have continued to attend so-called private schools, mostly schools operated by the Catholic Church and other religious denominations. The United States was not unique in moving from a mostly private to a mostly governmental system of schools. Indeed, one authority has described the gradual acceptance of the view that education ought to be a responsibility of the state as the most significant of the general trends of the 19th century that were still influencing education in all Western countries in the second half of the 20th century. Interestingly enough, this trend began in Prussia in 1808 and in France under Napoleon about the same time. Britain was even later than the United States. Under the spell of laissez-faire, it hesitated a long time before allowing the state to intervene in educational affairs. But finally, In 1870, a system of government schools was established. I'm trying to read this fast because the fucking security guard came. Though elementary education was not made compulsory until 1880, and fees were not generally abolished until 1891, in Britain, as in the United States, schooling was almost universal before the government took it over. So they didn't need no intervention. It's saying Professor West has maintained persuasively that the government takeover in Britain, as in the United States, resulted from pressure by teachers, administrators, and well-meaning intellectuals rather than parents. He concludes that the government takeover reduced the quality and diversity of schooling. Anyway, guys, I'll just make another. I'll put the video together. Stupid lady has nothing better to fucking do. Nothing better. Hey, God bless everybody with a job, but fuck that security. I'm gonna finish reading this shit. She'll probably creep up right now, but I moved down the hill. She had a problem with me being in the parking lot. It's a big parking lot when school's in session, which is gonna start next week, the winter program. Today's Saturday, I get it, but it's the first time I've ever seen her, so let's just finish this up. So, education is still another example, like Social Security, of the common element in authoritarian and socialist philosophies. Aristocratic and authoritarian Prussia and Imperial France were the pioneers in state control of education. So Prussia, so it's saying Prussia and France. Prussia and Imperial France, authoritarian, were the pioneers in state control of education. Socialistically inclined intellectuals in the United States, Britain, and later Republican France were the major supporters of state control in their countries. The establishment of the school system in the United States as an island of socialism and a free market reflected only to a very minor extent the early emergence among intellectuals of a distrust of the market and of voluntary exchange. It's in my pocket. So this is written a while ago, and it's talking about a socialistic sort of educational system, which that's what it is. Mostly, it simply reflected the importance that was attached by the community to the ideal of equality of opportunity. The ability of Horace Mann and his associates to tap that deep sentiment enabled them to succeed in their crusade. Needless to say, the public school system was not viewed as socialist, but simply as American. The most important factor determining how the system operated was its decentralized political structure. The U.S. Constitution narrowly limited the powers of the federal government so that it played no significant role. The states mostly left control of schools to the local community, the town, the small city, or a subdivision of a larger city. Close monitoring of the political authorities running the school system by parents was a partial substitute for competition and assured that any widely shared desires of parents were implemented. Before the Great Depression, the situation was already changing. School districts were consolidated, educational districts enlarged, and more power was granted to professional educators. After the Depression, when the public joined the intellectuals in an unbridled faith in the virtues of government, and especially of central government, the decline of the one-room school and the local school board became a rout. Power shifted rapidly from the local community to broader entities, the city, the county, the state, and more recently the federal government. In 1920, local funds made up 83% of all revenues in public schools. Federal grants less than 1%. By 1940, the local share had fallen to 68%. Currently, it is less than one half. The state provided most of the rest of the money, 16% in 1920, 30% in 1940, and currently more than 40%. The federal government's share is still small but growing rapidly, from less than 2% in 1940 to roughly 8% currently. As professional educators have taken over, control by parents has weakened. And in addition, The function assigned to schools has changed. They are still expected to teach the 3 R's and to transmit common values. In addition, however, schools are now regarded as means of promoting social mobility, racial integration, and other objectives only distantly related to the fundamental task. In Chapter 4, we referred to the theory of bureaucratic displacement that Dr. Max Gammon had developed after studying the British National Health Service. In his words, in a bureaucratic system, increase in expenditure will be matched by fall in production. Such systems will act rather like black holes in the economic universe, simultaneously sucking in resources and shrinking in terms of emitted production. Increase in expenditure will be a fall in production. Increase in expenditure will be matched by fall in production. His theory applies in full force to the effect of the increasing bureaucratization and centralization of the public school system in the United States. In the 5 years from school year 1971-72 to school year of 1976-77, total professional staff in all U.S. public schools went up 8%. Cost per pupil went up 58% in dollars, 11% after correction for inflation. Input clearly up. The number of students went down 4%, the number of schools went down 4%, and we suspect that few readers will demur from the proposition that the quality of schooling went down even more drastically than the quantity. That is certainly the story told by the declining grades recorded on standardized examinations. Output clearly down. Is the decline in output per unit of input due to increasingly bureaucratic and centralized organization? As some evidence, the number of school districts went down by 70% in the 7-year period from 1970-71 to 77-78, continuing the long-term trend to greater centralization. As to bureaucratization, for a somewhat earlier 5-year period for which data are available, from 1968 to 69 to 73-74, when the number of students went up 1%, the total professional staff went up 15%. And teachers 14%, but supervisors went up 44%. The problem in schooling is not mere size, not simply that school districts have become larger and that on the average, each school has more students. After all, in industry, size has often proved a source of greater efficiency, lower cost, and improved quality. Industrial development in the United States gained a great deal from the After all, in industry, size has often proved a source of greater efficiency, lower cost, and improved quality. Industrial development in the United States gained a great deal from the introduction of mass production for what economists call the economies of scale. Why should schooling be different? It isn't. The difference is not between schooling and other activities, but between arrangements under which the consumer is free to choose and arrangements under which the producer is in the saddle, so the consumer has little to say. If the consumer is free to choose, an enterprise can grow in size only if it produces an item that the consumer prefers because of either its quality or its price. If the consumer is free to choose, an enterprise can grow in size only if it produces an item that the consumer prefers because of either its quality or its price. And size alone will not enable any enterprise to impose a product on the consumer that the consumer does not consider is worth its price. And size alone will not enable any enterprise to impose a product on the consumer that the consumer does not consider is worth its price. The large size of General Motors has not prevented it from flourishing. The large size of W.T. Grant & Co. did not save it from bankruptcy. When the consumer is free to choose, size will survive only if it is efficient. In political arrangements, this is fucking profound right here. This is fucking profound. Profound. In political arrangements, size generally does affect consumers' freedom to choose. In small communities, the individual citizen feels that he has, and indeed does have, more control over what the political authorities do than in large communities. He may not have the same freedom to choose that he has in deciding whether to buy something or not, but at least he has a considerable opportunity to affect what happens. In addition, when there are many small communities, the individual can choose where to live. Of course, that is a complex choice involving many elements. Nonetheless, it does mean that local governments must provide their citizens with services they regard as worth the taxes they pay, or either be replaced or suffer the loss of taxpayers. The situation is very different when power is in the hands of a central government. The individual citizen feels that he has, and indeed does have, little control over the distant and impersonal political authorities. The possibility of moving to another community, though it may still be present, is far more limited. In schooling, the parent and child are the consumers. The teacher and school administrator, the producers. Centralization in schooling has meant large-sized units, a reduction in the ability of consumers to choose, and an increase in the power of producers. Teachers, administrators, and union officials are no different from the rest of us. They may be parents too, sincerely desiring a fine school system. However, their interests as teachers, as administrators, as union officials are different from their interests as parents and from the interests of the parents whose children they teach. Their interests may be served Their interests may be served by greater centralization and bureaucratization, even if the interests of the parents are not. Indeed, way in which the one way in which those interests are served is precisely by reducing the power of parents. The same phenomenon is present whenever government bureaucracy takes over at the expense of consumer choice, whether in the post office and garbage collection or in many examples in other chapters. In schooling, those of us who are in the upper income classes retain our freedom to choose. We can send our children to private schools, in effect paying twice for their schooling, once in taxes to support the public school system, once in school fees, or we can choose where to live on the basis of quality of the public school system. Excellent public schools tend to be concentrated in the wealthier suburbs of the larger cities, where parental control remains very real. The situation is worst in the inner cities of the large metropolises, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston. The people who live in these areas can pay twice for their children's schooling, only with great difficulty, though a surprising number do so by sending their children to parochial schools. They cannot afford to move to the areas with good public schools. Their only recourse is to try to influence the political authorities who are in charge of the public schools, usually a difficult, if not hopeless task, and one for which they are not well qualified. The residents of the inner cities are probably more disadvantaged in respect of the level of schooling they can get for their children than in any other areas of life, with the possible exception of crime protection, another service that is provided by government. The tragedy and irony is that a system dedicated to enabling all children to acquire a common language and the values of U.S. citizenship, to giving all children equal educational opportunities, should in practice exacerbate the stratification of society and provide highly unequal educational opportunity. Let me read that again. The tragedy and irony is that a system dedicated to enabling all children to acquire a common language and the values of U.S. citizenship, to giving all children equal educational opportunity, should in practice exacerbate the stratification of society and provide highly unequal educational opportunity. Expenditures on schooling per pupil are often as high in the inner cities as even in the wealthy suburbs, but the quality of schooling is vastly lower. In the suburbs, almost all of the money goes for education. In the inner cities, much of it must go to preserving discipline, preventing vandalism, or repairing its effects. The atmosphere in some inner city schools is more like that of a prison than of a place of learning. The parents in the suburbs are getting far more value for their tax dollars than the parents in the inner cities. You never think about that, right? They're spending more money on having to fucking protect people from crime and violence, and the tax money's going to fucking cleaning up the ghettos than it is to people who are just more educated and more like I guess better behaved, really.